Gideon, one of Israel's most notable judges, is known for his spectacular victory over the Midianites. But what happened next? What was Gideon's life like after this victory? How did you face the challenges of leadership? Let's explore these questions and more. Gideon was a man of humble origins who lived at a time when Israel was under the yoke of the Midianites. The situation was desperate, but Gideon was not a desperate man. He was a man of faith, although that faith was sometimes shaken by doubts. The first time we hear about Gideon in the Bible, he is hiding in the winepress, threshing wheat to hide it from the Midianites. It is in this moment of fear and uncertainty that the angel of the Lord appears to him, calling him to free Israel. Gideon, however, hesitates. He questions the angel and asks for proof that God really chose him. Here we see the first important lesson of Gideon's life. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Gideon doubted, but also sought confirmation from God. He placed a woolen fleece on the ground and asked God to wet it with dew, while the ground around him remained dry. God responded to his request, confirming his call. With God's confirmation, Gideon prepares for battle. But God has an unusual strategy. He reduces Gideon's army from 32,000 men to just 300, so that Israel will know that victory comes from God, not their own power. The battle is fought and the Midianites are defeated. Gideon becomes a hero and the people of Israel offer him kingship. But Gideon refuses. He knows that the true king of Israel is God. After the victory, Gideon takes on the role of judge, administering justice and keeping the peace. He has many children and builds an ephod, an object of worship. Unfortunately, the people begin to worship the ephod and Gideon fails to correct this idolatry. Gideon's death is followed by a return to idolatry and ingratitude toward his home. But his legacy remains. His victory over the Midianites and his leadership as a judge have a lasting impact on the history of Israel. Gideon's life teaches us many lessons. It shows us the importance of faith, even in the face of doubt. It shows us the importance of obedience to God, even when his instructions seem strange or frightening. And it shows us the importance of humility, rejecting royalty and recognizing that true victory comes from God. The story of Gideon is mentioned in the book of Hebrews, highlighting its importance for Christians. He is an example of faith and obedience, and his story continues to inspire and challenge believers today. The story of Gideon is relevant to us today. It challenges us to look beyond victory to consider the impact of our actions. It reminds us that true victory comes from God and that our faith and obedience to Him are more important than any earthly success. So, as we reflect on Gideon's legacy, let us remember that his story goes beyond his victory over the Midianites. Let us remember your faith, your obedience, your humility, and let us strive to follow his example in our own lives. Gideon, a biblical character from the Old Testament, is known for his victory over the Midianites. However, his story goes far beyond this achievement. Gideon was an ordinary man, from humble origins, who faced doubts and challenges on his path to leadership. Let's explore these lesser-known aspects of his life and understand how they shaped his role as a judge and leader. Gideon was the youngest of his family, which was part of the tribe of Manasseh, one of the least influential among the 12 tribes of Israel. He lived in Ophrah, an insignificant city in the mountainous region of Ephraim. His family was not rich or powerful, and Gideon worked as a farmer, a common occupation at that time. The life of Gideon and his people was not easy at all. Israel was under the rule of the Midianites, a nomadic desert people who regularly invaded the land of Israel, destroying crops and taking animals and food. These constant invasions left the people of Israel in a situation of extreme poverty and desperation. In this context, Gideon lived a life of fear and uncertainty. He doubted his ability to make a difference amid the oppression of the Midianites. He felt helpless and insignificant, a feeling many of us can relate to in times of adversity. However, it was in this scenario of doubt and fear that Gideon was called by God to free his people. The Bible reports that the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon while he was hiding, pounding wheat in a winepress to prevent the Midianites from taking it. The angel hailed him as a valiant warrior, and told him that God had chosen Gideon to deliver Israel from the Midianites. Gideon, however, did not readily accept this call. He questioned the angel, asking why God had abandoned his people and how he, Gideon, could save Israel, being the least of his family and his tribe the weakest. This response shows Gideon's doubt and insecurity, but also his honesty and willingness to dialogue with God. Despite his doubts, Gideon accepted God's call and assumed leadership of Israel. He gathered an army and, with God's help, defeated the Midianites, freeing his people from oppression. However, the victory over the Midianites was only the beginning of Gideon's challenges as a leader. After the victory, Gideon had to deal with the expectations and demands of his people. They wanted Gideon to be their king, but Gideon refused, reminding them that only God was king of Israel. This decision shows Gideon's humility and his understanding that true leadership is not about power, but about serving God and people. Gideon also had to deal with the temptation of power and wealth. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon received a large amount of gold, which he used to make an ephod, a priestly garment. However, the ephod became an object of worship for the people of Israel, leading them to distance themselves from God. This shows that, even with good intentions, Gideon was not immune to the dangers of power and wealth. Gideon's life before his divine call, his humble origins, and the situation of Israel at that time are fundamental aspects to understanding his legacy. They show us that Gideon was not a perfect hero, but an ordinary man with doubts and fears, who was called by God to a great mission. They show us that true leadership is not about power and glory, but about humility, service, and faithfulness to God. They show us that even in the midst of adversity, God can use ordinary people to accomplish great things. Gideon, a biblical character who features prominently in the book of Judges, is known for his victory over the Midianites. However, there is much more to his story than just this achievement. Gideon was an ordinary man, full of doubts and uncertainties, who was called to an extraordinary task. His journey of faith and leadership is an example for all of us. Gideon's story begins with an angelic apparition. While he was hiding in the winepress, trying to thresh wheat out of the sight of the Midianites, an angel of the Lord appeared to him. The angel hailed him as a valiant warrior, and told him that the Lord was with him. Gideon, however, was full of doubts. He questioned the angel, asking him where were all the miracles that his ancestors had told him about. He wondered why Israel was suffering at the hands of the Midianites if the Lord was really with them. Gideon's initial hesitation is something many of us can relate to. How many times do we question the presence of God in our lives when things are not going well? How often do we doubt our calling or purpose when we feel inadequate or unprepared? Gideon was in the same boat. He did not see himself as a brave warrior. He saw himself as the least of his family, which was the poorest in Manasseh. However, the angel of the Lord did not depart from Gideon because of his doubts. Instead, the angel reaffirmed Gideon's call and told him that he would defeat the Midianites as if they were one man. The angel also gave him a sign to confirm his message, causing fire to arise from a rock to consume Gideon's offering. Gideon's initial doubt and the way the angel handled it are an important part of his legacy. They show us that it is normal to have doubts and questions when we are called to something big. They also show us that God is patient with us in our doubts. He does not reject us because of them, but gives us confirmation and encouragement to help us overcome them. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon faced the challenge of leading Israel. He had been called to be a judge, a role that involved more than simply leading the army into battle. As a judge, Gideon was responsible for leading the people in worship of God and obedience to his law. He was also responsible for resolving disputes and maintaining peace between the tribes. Leading after victory was not easy for Gideon. He had to deal with envy and rivalry between the tribes. He also had to deal with his own temptation to become prideful and forget God. However, despite these challenges, Gideon remained faithful to his calling. He continued to guide Israel back to the worship of God and maintain peace between the tribes. Gideon's leadership after his victory over the Midianites is another important part of his legacy. She shows us that leadership is not just about winning, but also about what happens next. She shows us that true leadership involves humility, service, and faithfulness to God, even when it is difficult. In short, Gideon's legacy goes far beyond his victory over the Midianites. It includes his journey of self-doubt, his call to lead, and the challenges he faced after winning. Every aspect of his story offers us valuable lessons about faith, leadership, and the nature of God. Gideon, one of the best-known judges of the Old Testament, is often remembered for his spectacular victory over the Midianites. However, his story goes far beyond this achievement. Gideon was an ordinary man, full of doubts and uncertainties, who was called by God to lead his people in a time of great need. And it is in this journey of doubt and leadership where we find valuable lessons for our own lives. One of the most surprising episodes in Gideon's life is the confirmation of his calling through the episode of the Fleece. This event marks a milestone in Gideon's life, as it is the moment in which he receives confirmation from God that he was chosen to free Israel from the Midianites. Gideon was hiding wheat in the winepress to prevent the Midianites from stealing it when the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon, however, was full of doubts. He questioned the angel, asking him where all the miracles his parents told him about were. He felt abandoned by God, while Israel was being oppressed by the Midianites. That's when Gideon asked God for a sign. He placed a fleece of wool on the ground and prayed that in the morning the fleece would be wet with dew, but that the ground around it would be dry. God granted his request. The next morning, Gideon wrung out the fleece and filled a container with water. However, Gideon still wasn't sure. Then he asked for another sign. This time he asked that the fleece be dry and that the ground around it be wet. And again God granted his request. The next morning the fleece was dry, but the ground around it was wet with dew. These signs were the confirmation Gideon needed to believe that God had truly chosen him to deliver Israel. They show God's patience and mercy in facing our doubts and fears. God did not rebuke Gideon for asking for signs. Instead, he responded to their requests, showing that he is willing to meet us where we are and help us in our struggles with doubt. After confirming his calling, Gideon faced the challenge of leading the people of Israel. He had to deal with fear, uncertainty, and the responsibility of leading an army against a powerful enemy. However, he also experienced God's faithfulness in incredible ways. Gideon's leadership after the victory over the Midianites was also marked by challenges. He had to deal with the temptation of power and the pressure of becoming king. He also had to deal with the idolatry of the people, who quickly forgot God after the victory and returned to worshiping idols. The story of Gideon shows us that doubt and uncertainty are normal parts of the journey of faith. God does not rebuke us for our doubts, but rather patiently meets us where we are and helps us overcome them. It also shows us that leadership comes with challenges, but that God is faithful to guide us and give us victory. Gideon's life is a testimony to God's power to use ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. He was a man full of doubts and fears, but God used him to free Israel. And like Gideon, God can use each of us, with all our doubts and uncertainties, to do His will and bring glory to His name. Gideon, one of the best-known judges of the Old Testament, is often remembered for his victory, spectacular on the Midianites. However, Gideon's story goes far beyond this battle. He was a leader who faced doubts, challenges, and had to deal with the consequences of his victory. God's strategy for the battle against the Midianites is one of the most fascinating aspects of Gideon's story. God commanded Gideon to reduce his army from 32,000 men to just 300. This may seem like a strange strategy, but God had a clear purpose for it. He wanted Israel to know that the victory was theirs, not theirs. The reduction of Gideon's army was a test of faith for the leader. He had to trust God, even when human logic said otherwise. Gideon could have questioned God's wisdom, but he chose to obey. This obedience was fundamental to Israel's victory. The battle strategy God gave Gideon was also unusual. Instead of attacking the Midianites with swords and shields, Gideon's 300 men were instructed to use trumpets, empty jars, and torches. Again, this may seem strange to human logic, but God had a plan. When Gideon's 300 men blew the trumpets, broke the jars, and lit the torches, the Midianites panicked. They attacked each other and fled. The victory was Israel's, but it was clearly the work of God. God's strategy for battle and the reduction of Gideon's army are powerful examples of how God works in ways we often do not understand. It is not limited by human logic or human expectations. God has His own plans and purposes and can use any situation for His glory. Gideon's life after his victory over the Midianites is also noteworthy. He had to face the challenges of leading a people who had been freed from their oppressors. Gideon had to help Israel readjust to freedom and reorient themselves toward God. Gideon also had to deal with his own doubts and insecurities. Despite his victory over the Midianites, he still struggled with doubts. He questioned his ability to lead and had to rely on God for the guidance and strength he needed. The story of Gideon is a powerful reminder that God uses imperfect people to accomplish His purposes. Gideon was not a perfect leader. I had doubts and insecurities, but he was willing to obey God, even when he didn't understand God's plan. And God used Gideon in powerful ways. Gideon's life challenges us to trust God, even when we don't understand His plans. It challenges us to obey God, even when His direction seems strange to us. And it reminds us that God can use imperfect people, like Gideon and us, to accomplish his purposes. The story of Gideon is more than just a story of victory over the Midianites. It is a story of faith, obedience, and leadership. It is a story that challenges us to trust God, to obey Him, and to allow God to use us for His purposes. And it's a story that reminds us that even in our doubts and insecurities, God is working in us and through us for His glory. Gideon, one of the best-known judges of the Old Testament, is often remembered for his spectacular victory over the Midianites. However, Gideon's story goes far beyond this battle. He faced a journey of self-doubt and leadership challenges that shaped his role as a judge and leader. Gideon's victory over the Midianites is one of the most dramatic stories in the Bible. With an army of only 300 men, Gideon defeated an army of thousands. The battle was fought in the Jezreel Valley, where the Midianites had camped. Gideon divided his small army into 3 groups, and in the middle of the night they attacked. Each soldier carried a trumpet and a jar with a torch inside. When Gideon gave the signal, they broke the jars, exposing the torches, and blew the trumpets. The noise and light frightened the Midianites, who turned against each other in confusion. Gideon and his men pursued the fleeing Midianites and achieved complete victory. The reaction of the people of Israel to Gideon's victory was one of joy and gratitude. They recognized that God had delivered the Midianites into their hands and praised Gideon as a hero. However, Gideon rejected the people's offer to make him king, saying, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Judges 8 verse 23. Despite his spectacular victory, Gideon faced significant challenges as a leader. He had to deal with the envy and hostility of other tribes of Israel, who resented his success. Furthermore, he had to face the temptation of power. After his victory, Gideon made an ephod, an object of worship, from the gold he had captured from the Midianites. However, the ephod became a trap for Gideon and his family, causing them to turn away from God. Gideon's journey was also marked by doubt. Despite God's repeated assurances, Gideon often questioned whether he was really the one chosen to lead Israel to victory. He asked God for several signs to confirm his call, including the famous episode of the Fleece. This doubt did not disappear after the victory over the Midianites. Gideon continued to struggle with uncertainty and insecurity even as he led Israel. Gideon's story shows us that leadership is not just about spectacular victories. It is also about facing doubt, envy, and temptation. Gideon was not a perfect leader, but he was a man who sought God in the midst of his failures and uncertainties. It reminds us that God can use imperfect people to achieve His purposes. Gideon's victory over the Midianites is an important part of his story, but it is not the whole story. To truly understand Gideon's legacy, we must look beyond the battle and explore the journey of self-doubt and leadership challenges he faced. These aspects of his life give us a more complete picture of who Gideon was and the role he played as judge and leader of Israel. After his victory over the Midianites, Gideon faced a challenge that was perhaps as great as the battle he had just ended. Cattle. The people of Israel, impressed by his leadership and courage, offered him the crown and asked him to become their king. However, Gideon refused. Gideon's refusal to become king is a fascinating aspect of his story. He could have accepted the offer and become the first king of Israel, but he decided not to. This begs the question, why did he refuse? What led you to make this decision? Gideon was a man of faith. He firmly believed that God was the only king of Israel. When the people offered him the crown, he responded, "I will not be king over you, nor will my son reign over you. The Lord will reign over you." Judges 8 verse 23. Gideon recognized that the victory over the Midianites was not his, but God's. He did not want to usurp the glory that belonged to God. Furthermore, Gideon understood that leadership is not about power, but about serving. He knew that his mission was to free Israel from the Midianites, and he fulfilled it. He was not interested in using his victory to gain power or prestige. He didn't want to be king. "I wanted to be a servant of God." However, Gideon's refusal to become king did not mean that he abandoned his leadership. He continued to lead Israel, but in a different way. He became a judge, a leader who ruled with wisdom and justice rather than power and authority. He guided the people of Israel back to the worship of God, helping them free themselves from the idolatry that had infiltrated their society. Gideon's leadership after the victory over the Midianites was marked by humility and service. He did not get carried away by success or the praise of the people. He remained faithful to God and his mission. He understood that true leadership is not about being at the top, but about leading people in the right direction. Gideon's refusal to become king also had a significant impact on Israel's history. If he had accepted the crown, the monarchy in Israel would have begun with him, not with Saul. Israel's history could have been very different. However, Gideon decided to follow God's plan instead of his own. The story of Gideon teaches us many lessons about leadership. It shows us that true leadership is about serving, not ruling. It shows us that leadership requires humility, not pride. It shows us that a leader must always put God first, not himself. Gideon's refusal to become king is a testament to his faith in God and his commitment to service. He did not allow success or the praise of the people to divert him from his mission. He remained faithful to God and his calling. Gideon's life after his victory over the Midianites is a story of faithful and humble leadership. It shows us that true greatness comes not from titles or power, but from service to God and others. It shows us that true leadership is not about being served, but about serving. Gideon leaves us a legacy of faith, humility, and service. It challenges us to be leaders who put God first, who serve instead of being served, and who seek God's glory instead of our own. He challenges us to be leaders who, like him, are willing to say, "I will not be king over you, the Lord will reign over you." Gideon, one of Israel's most notable judges, is often remembered for his spectacular victory over them, the Midianites. However, his legacy goes far beyond this military achievement. Gideon was also an effective administrative leader who played a crucial role in maintaining peace and administering justice in Israel. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon faced the challenge of leading a people accustomed to living under oppression. It had to address a number of complex issues, including the administration of justice, peacekeeping, and resource management. Gideon showed great wisdom and skill in facing these challenges, which contributed to the stability and prosperity of Israel during his tenure as judge. Gideon played a crucial role in the administration of justice in Israel. It established a fair and equitable justice system, ensuring that all citizens were treated fairly regardless of their social or economic status. Gideon also strove to ensure that laws were applied consistently, which helped maintain order and stability in society. Additionally, Gideon played an important role in keeping peace in Israel. He worked tirelessly to resolve conflicts and disputes, thus preventing the escalation of violence. Gideon also strove to promote unity among the different tribes of Israel, which was essential to maintaining peace and stability in the country. Gideon also showed great skill in managing Israel's resources. He implemented effective policies to ensure that resources were distributed fairly and equitably, helping to promote the prosperity and well-being of all citizens. However, Gideon's leadership was not without challenges. He had to deal with resistance from some tribes who refused to recognize him as their leader. Additionally, Gideon had to deal with the temptation to abuse his power for personal gain. However, he managed to overcome these challenges and maintained his integrity and commitment to justice and peace. Gideon's leadership as a judge was also marked by his unwavering faith in God. He recognized that his strength and wisdom came from God, and he constantly depended on God for his guidance and strength. This deep faith in God was a source of inspiration for the people of Israel and played a crucial role in shaping their identity as God's people. In short, Gideon's legacy goes far beyond his victory over the Midianites. He was an effective leader who played a crucial role in administering justice and maintaining peace in Israel. His leadership was marked by his wisdom, administrative skill, and unwavering faith in God. These aspects of his leadership contributed to the stability and prosperity of Israel during his tenure as judge and continue to be a source of inspiration for future generations. Gideon, one of the best-known judges of the Old Testament, is often remembered for his showmanship, victory over the Midianites. However, Gideon's life after this victory is less known but equally fascinating. Today we will explore this part of Gideon's story, focusing on his personal life, his many sons, and the building of the Ephod. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon returned to his normal life, but with a new responsibility: the leadership of Israel. He did not become king, as the people had proposed, but instead assumed the role of judge, directing and guiding the people in matters of justice and peace. However, leadership was not without its challenges. Gideon had to deal with the doubt, pressure, and responsibility of leading a people who had recently experienced a great victory. Gideon also had a very complex family life. He had many children, 70 to be exact. These children came from several wives, which was common at that time. However, one of these sons, Abimelech, stood out. Abimelech was the son of Gideon's concubine, and after his father's death, he proclaimed himself king and ruled with tyranny, in stark contrast to Gideon's leadership. The building of the ephod is also an important aspect of Gideon's life after the victory. The ephod was a priestly garment, generally worn by the high priest. Gideon built a golden ephod as a way to thank God for the victory over the Midianites. However, this action had unexpected consequences. The ephod became an object of worship for the people of Israel, distracting them from worshiping God. Gideon's life after his victory over the Midianites is a story of challenges, doubts, and decisions. He had to deal with the pressure of leading a people in peacetime, the complexity of a large family, and the unexpected consequences of his actions. Yet through it all, Gideon remained faithful to God and his calling. The story of Gideon shows us that victory is not the end of the journey, but often the beginning of new challenges. It teaches us that leadership comes with responsibilities and challenges, and that our actions can have unintended consequences. But above all, the story of Gideon reminds us that even in the midst of doubts and challenges, we can remain faithful to God and the calling He has given us. Gideon's life after victory is an important part of his legacy. He is not only the warrior who defeated the Midianites, but also the leader who guided Israel in times of peace, the father of many children and the man who, despite his failures and mistakes, remained faithful to God. And it is that legacy, a legacy of faith, leadership, and faithfulness, that continues to inspire and challenge us today. Gideon, one of the Bible's best-known judges, is often remembered for his spectacular victory over the Midianites. However, Gideon's story goes far beyond this victory. After the victory, he faced a journey of self-doubt and leadership challenges that shaped his role as a judge and leader. A lesser-known but crucial aspect of his life is the ephod and the idolatry that followed. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon made a request to the people of Israel. He asked each man to give him a gold earring from the spoils of war. With this gold, Gideon made an ephod, a type of priestly garment, and placed it in his city, Ophrah. The Bible tells us that all Israel played the harlot there, and the ephod was a trap for Gideon and his house. Judges 8 verse 27. Here we see a side of Gideon that is less talked about. Despite his faith and courage, Gideon was also human and, as such, susceptible to making mistakes. The creation of the ephod was one of those mistakes. Although Gideon's intention may have been good, the result was disastrous. The people of Israel began to worship the ephod as an idol, distancing themselves from God. Gideon's failure here is a reminder that even the strongest and most faithful leaders can fall into the trap of idolatry. Gideon unwittingly allowed the people to replace the worship of God with the worship of an object made by human hands. This shows how easy it is for us humans to stray from God and focus on tangible, visible things instead of trusting in the invisible God. The idolatry of the ephod also reveals Israel's constant struggle against idolatry, a recurring theme throughout the Old Testament. Although God repeatedly delivered Israel from their enemies, the people continued to turn to idols. This highlights the stubborn and rebellious nature of the human heart, which can only be transformed by the power of God. The story of Gideon also shows us that leadership comes with responsibilities and challenges. Gideon had to deal with doubts, pressures, and temptations. He had to make difficult decisions and face the consequences of those decisions. Leadership is not only about victories and successes, but also about facing failures and mistakes. Gideon's failure with the ephod is a reminder to all of us that we must be constantly alert against idolatry in our lives. We need to remember that only God is worthy of our worship and that nothing, not even the good things we have or do, should take God's place in our hearts. In short, Gideon's life is a story of faith, courage, doubt, failure, and redemption. He was an ordinary man called by God to do extraordinary things. He had incredible victories and made serious mistakes. But through it all, God was working in his life and through him to fulfill his purposes. The story of Gideon challenges us to trust God, even in the midst of doubt and fear, and to remain faithful to him despite our failures and mistakes. Gideon, one of Israel's best-known judges, left a legacy that goes beyond the victory over the Midianites. His life was marked by doubts, challenges, and leadership that, despite its flaws, was used by God to free the people of Israel. But what happened after Gideon's death? How did the people react, and what were the consequences for Gideon's house? After Gideon's death, the Bible reports that the people of Israel quickly returned to idolatry. They abandoned the God who had delivered them from the hands of the Midianites and began to worship the Baals, specifically Baal-Berita. This return to idolatry was a direct betrayal of Gideon's legacy and the God he served. Idolatry was not only a sin against God, but also a demonstration of ingratitude toward the house of Gideon. Although Gideon led the people to victory against the Midianites, after his death the people showed no loyalty to his family. Not only did they abandon God, but they also turned against the house of Gideon. The Bible reports that all of Gideon's brothers were killed except Jotham, the youngest, who managed to escape. This act of violence against Gideon's house was a betrayal of the man who had risked his life to free the people of Israel. The ingratitude of the people is even more evident when we consider that Abimelech, the son of Gideon who led the massacre against his brothers, was actually the son of a concubine and had no legitimate claim to leadership. The people's reaction to Gideon's death reveals a sad truth about human nature. Although God used Gideon to free the people of Israel, they quickly forgot his actions and returned to their old ways. This is an important lesson for us today. We often quickly forget the blessings we have received and return to our old ways. The story of Gideon and the reaction of the people after his death also remind us of the importance of faithful leadership. Gideon was not perfect, but he strove to guide the people according to God's will. After his death, the lack of faithful leadership led the people back to idolatry. Gideon's life is a reminder that despite our failures and doubts, God can use us to accomplish great things. However, the reaction of the people after his death is also a warning about how easily we can forget God's blessings and return to our old ways. The story of Gideon and the reaction of the people after his death challenge us to remember God's blessings in our lives and to remain faithful to him, even in the midst of challenges and changes. It also reminds us of the importance of faithful leaders who guide us according to God's will. In short, Gideon's death and the subsequent reaction of the people of Israel is a crucial part of Gideon's legacy. It reveals the fragility of human faith and the constant need for faithful leadership. Despite the people's ingratitude and betrayal, Gideon's story remains a powerful lesson in faith, leadership, and God's sovereignty. Gideon, one of Israel's most notable judges, left a legacy that goes beyond the victory over the Midianites. His life, marked by doubts, challenges, and leadership, had a significant impact on the history of Israel. Gideon was an ordinary man, with extraordinary faith. He was neither a trained warrior nor a born leader. He was a simple man, who worked in the field, but who was called by God to free Israel from the yoke of the Midianites. Gideon's journey began with doubts. When the angel of the Lord appeared to him and told him that he would deliver Israel, Gideon questioned. He did not see himself as a leader, much less a liberator. But God, in his infinite wisdom, saw in Gideon what he himself could not see. Gideon had to overcome his doubts and fears to assume the leadership that God had entrusted to him. He had to learn to trust God and follow his instructions, even when they didn't make sense to him. Gideon's victory over the Midianites was not only a military victory, but also a spiritual victory. He showed that with God, even the weakest can become strong. He showed that faith in God is more powerful than any army. But the victory over the Midianites was only the beginning of Gideon's journey. After the victory, he had to face the challenge of leading Israel. He had to deal with the expectations of the people, who wanted him to be king. But Gideon knew that Israel already had a king, God. He rejected the people's offer and continued serving as a judge. Gideon's leadership was not easy. He had to make difficult decisions and face opposition from many, but he remained faithful to God and his calling. He administered justice and kept peace in Israel during his tenure as judge. However, Gideon also made mistakes. He built an ephod, which eventually became an object of worship for the people. This showed that despite his faith and leadership, Gideon was still human and prone to failure. The life of Gideon shows us that faith in God does not exempt us from doubts and challenges, but it also shows us that, with God, we can overcome these challenges and achieve great victories. Gideon's legacy goes beyond the victory over the Midianites. He left a legacy of faith, courage, and leadership. He showed that it is possible to trust God, even in the midst of doubts and challenges. He demonstrated that it is possible to lead with integrity and fairness, even in the face of pressure and opposition. Gideon's influence on the history of Israel is undeniable. He freed Israel from the yoke of the Midianites and led the people with wisdom and justice. But above all, he showed that true strength comes from God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that, with God, we can overcome our doubts and fears. It shows us that, with God, we can face challenges and achieve victories. It shows us that, with God, we can lead with integrity and justice. Gideon's legacy is a legacy of faith, courage, and leadership. It is a legacy that inspires us to trust God, face our challenges, and lead with integrity and justice. It is a legacy that reminds us that, With God, everything is possible. Gideon, one of the most notable judges in the Bible, is known for his spectacular victory over the Midianites. But what many do not know is that Gideon's life went far beyond this victory. He faced doubts, challenges, and had to learn to lead after victory. Today we will explore these lesser-known aspects of Gideon's life and how they shaped his role as a judge and leader. Gideon was an ordinary man, from a poor family from the tribe of Manasseh. He did not consider himself a leader or a warrior. In fact, when God called him to deliver Israel from the Midianites, Gideon hesitated. He wondered if God could really use him for such a task. This doubt is something many of us can relate to. How often do we doubt our abilities or God's plan for our lives? But the story of Gideon shows us that God does not call the qualified, He qualifies the called. Gideon had to learn to trust God, obey His word, and humble himself before Him. These are valuable lessons that we can apply to our lives today. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon faced the challenge of leadership. He had to make difficult decisions and face opposition from his own people. But again, he trusted God and followed His guidance. This shows us the importance of remaining faithful to God, even when circumstances are difficult. The figure of Gideon in the Bible is mentioned in the book of Hebrews, where he is among the heroes of faith. His story is important for Christians because it shows us that God can use anyone, regardless of their circumstances, to achieve His purposes. The story of Gideon is relevant today because it teaches us about faith, obedience, and humility. It shows us that God is in control and that He can use anyone who is willing to trust Him and obey His word. As we reflect on Gideon's legacy, it is important to look beyond the victory and consider the impact of our actions. Gideon was not perfect. He made mistakes and faced challenges. But he was also a man of faith who trusted God and obeyed His word. And that is what we must remember about him. Gideon's life teaches us that faith, obedience, and humility are essential in our walk with God. It teaches us that God can use anyone who is willing to trust Him and obey His word. And it reminds us that even in the midst of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and follow His guidance. So as you reflect on Gideon's life, remember these lessons. Remember that God can use you no matter your circumstances. Remember to trust God, obey His word, and humble yourself before Him. And remember that even after victory, it is important to continue trusting God and following His guidance. Gideon's life is a powerful testimony of what God can do through a person who trusts Him and obeys His word. And it is a reminder to all of us that, with God, all things are possible. Gideon is a biblical figure who stands out for his leadership and courage, but also for his humanity, marked by doubts and challenges. His story, recorded in the book of Judges, chapters 6-8, is a source of inspiration for many Christians, but also an invitation to reflect on the complexity of being human and the way God works in our lives. Gideon was the youngest in his family, which belonged to the smallest tribe of Israel, Manasseh. He was considered insignificant, but God chose him to free Israel from the Midianites, a nomadic people who oppressed the Israelites. God's choice of Gideon, despite his apparent insignificance, is a powerful reminder that God does not see as man sees. Go beyond appearances and human limitations. Gideon's journey begins with doubts. When the angel of the Lord appears to him and calls him a mighty warrior, Gideon questions. He asks where the miracles his ancestors spoke of are and why God abandoned Israel. This initial doubt of Gideon is something that many Christians can relate to. In times of difficulty, it is common to question the presence and action of God. However, God's response to Gideon is encouraging. He does not rebuke Gideon for his doubts, but instead encourages him by saying, "Go in your strength and save Israel from the Midianites. Am I not the one who sent you?" Judges 6 verse 14. God recognizes Gideon's doubt, but also challenges him to act, to go beyond his uncertainty. Gideon's victory over the Midianites is notable. With only 300 men, he defeats an army of thousands. But the victory is not Gideon's, it is God's. It is God who reduces Gideon's army, so that Israel will not boast against him, saying, "My own strength saved me." Judges 7 verse 2. It is God who confuses the Midianites, making them fight among themselves. Gideon's victory is, in fact, God's victory. But Gideon's story does not end with victory. After the victory, Gideon faces the challenge of leading. He is appointed judge of Israel, but his leadership is marked by failures. He makes an ephod, an object of worship, which becomes a trap for him and his family. He has many sons, and one of them, Abimelech, ends up causing great suffering to Israel. The story of Gideon is mentioned in the book of Hebrews, in the famous faith chapter, Hebrews 11. Gideon is among the heroes of faith, those who conquered kingdoms, did justice, achieved what was promised, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of the fire and escaped the edge of the sword. From weakness they drew strength, they became mighty in battle and put foreign armies to flight. Hebrews 11 verses 33 to 34. The inclusion of Gideon in this list is significant. Despite his failures and doubts, Gideon is remembered for his faith. He is remembered not for his perfection, but for his willingness to follow God, even in the midst of uncertainty and fear. The story of Gideon is important for Christians because it reminds us that God uses imperfect people to achieve his purposes. It reminds us that faith is not the absence of doubts, but the willingness to follow God despite doubts. It reminds us that victory is God's, not ours. And it reminds us that leadership is a challenge, requiring humility and dependence on God. Gideon's life is a testimony to the power of God and the grace of God. He was called when he felt insignificant, he had doubts, but he was encouraged by God. He was used by God to deliver Israel despite their weakness. He led, but he also failed. And despite his flaws, he is remembered as a hero of the faith. The story of Gideon is an invitation to reflect on our own journey of faith. Like Gideon, we are called by God despite our limitations. Like Gideon, we may have doubts, but God encourages us to overcome them. Like Gideon, God uses us to fulfill his purposes, even when we feel weak. And like Gideon, we are remembered not for our perfection but for our faith. Gideon's legacy goes beyond the victory over the Midianites. His legacy is a reminder of the power of God, the grace of God, and the faith that, even in the midst of doubt and fear, chooses to follow God. A biblical character who stands out in the book of Judges is known for his impressive victory about the Midianites. But there is much more to Gideon's story than just this victory. He was a leader who faced doubts, challenges, and had to deal with the consequences of his actions after victory. Gideon is mentioned in the book of Hebrews, in the New Testament, as one of the heroes of faith. This shows us that his story has significant importance for Christians. But why is Gideon so important? What can we learn from his life and leadership? And how does his legacy extend beyond his victory over the Midianites? Gideon was the youngest in his family, which was part of the smallest tribe of Israel. He didn't see himself as a leader or a hero. However, when God called him to deliver Israel from the Midianites, Gideon answered the call. I had doubts, it's true. He asked God for signs to confirm the call. But despite his doubts, Gideon obeyed God and led a small army of 300 men against the Midianites. Gideon's victory over the Midianites is a story of faith and obedience. But Gideon's story doesn't end there. After the victory, Gideon faced the challenge of leading Israel. He made some questionable decisions, such as creating a golden ephod that became a trap for the Israelites. This shows us that even heroes of faith can make mistakes. The story of Gideon is relevant to us today because it shows us that God can use ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Gideon was not a warrior or leader by nature. I had doubts and fears, but God used him to free Israel. It reminds us that God does not look at our strengths or abilities. He looks at our hearts and our willingness to obey him. Gideon's leadership also teaches us important lessons. It shows us that leadership comes with challenges and responsibilities. The decisions we make as leaders can have lasting consequences. Gideon made a decision that led Israel to turn away from God. It reminds us to be careful and wise in our decisions, especially when we are in leadership positions. Gideon's legacy goes beyond his victory over the Midianites. He leaves us an example of faith, obedience, and leadership. It shows us that God can use ordinary people to do extraordinary things. It reminds us of the importance of being careful and wise in our decisions. And it teaches us that even when we make mistakes, God can still use our lives for his purpose. The story of Gideon is a story of faith, doubt, victory, and challenge. It is a story that challenges us to look beyond victory and consider the impact of our actions. It is a story that reminds us that even in the midst of doubts and challenges, we can be used by God to achieve extraordinary things. And it is a story that teaches us the importance of looking beyond victory and considering the impact of our actions. The figure of Gideon in the Bible is complex and multifaceted. He is a hero, a leader, a man of faith, but also a man with doubts and flaws. His story is a story of triumph and tragedy, of faith and failure. And it is a story that has a lot to teach us today. Gideon is a biblical figure many know for his victory over the Midianites, but there is much more to his story that deserves to be explored. His life is marked by a journey of doubts, leadership challenges, and a legacy that goes beyond military victory. Gideon was an ordinary man, from a poor family from the tribe of Manasseh. He did not consider himself a leader or a warrior. When the angel of the Lord appeared to him and called him a mighty warrior, Gideon questioned. He doubted himself and God. This doubt is something many of us can relate to. How many times have we felt inadequate, incapable, or insufficient for the task that God has called us to perform? Gideon's doubts did not end there. Even after God gave him a sign, he still asked for another. He placed a wool fleece on the ground and asked God to let the dew fall only on the fleece and keep the ground dry. God did it, but Gideon still wasn't convinced. He asked God to do the opposite the next night. Keep the fleece dry and let the dew fall to the ground. And God did that too. This story shows God's patience with our doubts and fears. He understands our humanity and is willing to give us the confirmation we need to move forward in faith. But it also shows that doubt is not the end of the story. Gideon may have started with doubts, but he didn't stop there. He went from doubt to faith and from faith to action. After his victory over the Midianites, Gideon faced new challenges. He was called to lead his people in times of peace. This may seem easier than leading in times of war, but it can actually be more difficult. In times of peace, people often become complacent. They forget the lessons learned in battle and begin to distance themselves from God. Gideon had to face these challenges. He had to keep his people focused on God and remind them where they came from. He had to deal with internal disputes and maintain unity among the tribes. He had to resist the temptation to become king and remind the people that God was their true king. Gideon's leadership was not perfect. He made mistakes. He made a golden ephod that the people began to worship, forgetting God. But despite his mistakes, Gideon left a legacy of faith and courage. The story of Gideon is relevant to us today because it shows us that God can use ordinary people to do extraordinary things. It shows us that doubt is not the end of the story, but can be the beginning of a journey of faith. It shows us that leadership is a challenge, but with God's help, we can overcome these challenges and leave a legacy of faith. We can learn from the life of Gideon that our identity is not defined by our circumstances, but by who God says we are. We can learn that doubt is a normal part of the journey of faith and that God is patient with us in our doubts. We can learn that leadership is more than just making decisions. It is about influencing people to follow God. Gideon's life is a reminder that God calls us not because we are capable, but because He is capable. He calls us not because we have all the answers, but because He has them. He calls us not because we are strong, but because He is. And when we doubt, when we feel inadequate, when we feel overwhelmed, we can look at the story of Gideon and remember that God is bigger than our doubts, our fears, and our challenges. And that's something we all need to hear today. Gideon is a biblical figure many know for his victory over the Midianites, but there is much more to his story that deserves to be explored. His life was marked by doubts, challenges, and leadership that extended far beyond the battlefield. Gideon was an ordinary man, without great achievements or titles, when he was called by God to free the people of Israel from the Midianites. He did not consider himself a leader, much less a warrior. In fact, Gideon was full of doubts and uncertainties. He questioned God, asked for signs and proof that he was really chosen for this mission. This journey of doubt is an important aspect of Gideon's life that is often overlooked. He was not an infallible hero, but a man with fears and insecurities. However, despite his doubts, Gideon decided to obey God and move forward. He learned to trust God, even when circumstances seemed impossible. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon faced the challenge of leading a people accustomed to oppression and fear. He had to deal with internal conflicts, power struggles, and the temptation to become king. Gideon, however, rejected the title of king, reminding the people that the true king of Israel was God. Gideon's leadership after victory is an example of humility and service. He did not seek power or glory for himself, but instead sought to bring the people back to God. Gideon faced many challenges as a leader, but he remained true to his mission. Gideon's story is relevant today because it shows us that leadership is not just about victories and achievements, but also about dealing with doubts, facing challenges, and serving others. Gideon teaches us that true leadership comes from God and that we must trust Him even when circumstances are difficult. We can learn a lot from Gideon's life and leadership. It shows us that it is normal to have doubts and fears, but that we must trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example of faith, obedience, and humility. He was not a perfect hero, but an ordinary man who decided to obey God and lead his people. Gideon shows us that God can use any of us, with all our doubts and fears, to do great things. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon's life is an example for all of us. It shows us that even when we face doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon teaches us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. The story of Gideon is a story of improvement, faith, and leadership. It teaches us that, even in the face of doubts and challenges, we can trust God and move forward. Gideon shows us that true leadership is not about power or glory, but about serving others and leading people back to God. Gideon is a biblical figure known for his victory over the Midianites, but there is much more to his story than that. Achievement. He was an ordinary man, full of doubts and uncertainties, who was called by God to guide his people in a time of great need. And it is in this journey of doubt and leadership where we find valuable lessons for our lives today. Gideon was the youngest of his family, which was the poorest in Manasseh. He did not see himself as a leader, much less a liberator. When the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior," Gideon questioned. He doubted himself and God. But God, in his patience, answered all of Gideon's doubts, giving him signs and confirmations. This journey of doubt is something many of us can relate to. How many times do we doubt ourselves, our abilities, our vocation? How many times do we wonder if God can really use someone like us? But the story of Gideon shows us that God does not call the qualified, but rather he qualifies the called. He sees beyond our limitations and doubts, and sees what we can become in his hands. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon faced the challenge of leading his people. He rejected the offer to become king, saying, "The Lord will reign over you." However, he made a golden ephod that became a trap for him and his people, leading them into idolatry. This shows us that even after great victories, we can still fall. Leadership brings its own challenges and temptations, and we must be constantly alert. Gideon's legacy goes beyond his victory over the Midianites. It shows us the importance of looking beyond victory and considering the impact of our actions. It reminds us that even in our doubts and uncertainties, God can use us in powerful ways. It challenges us to lead with humility and integrity, recognizing that we are fallible and need God's grace. In conclusion, Gideon's life is a story of faith, doubt, victory, and leadership. He was an ordinary man, full of doubts and uncertainties, but God used him in an extraordinary way. It reminds us that God can use any of us, no matter how inadequate or insecure we may feel. And it challenges us to look beyond our victories and consider the impact of our actions. I hope you enjoyed this video and that it gave you a new perspective on Gideon's life. If you liked it, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave a comment below with your opinion. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Gideon is a biblical figure known for his victory over the Midianites, but there is much more to his story that deserves to be explored. His life was marked by doubts, challenges, and leadership that extended beyond the battlefield. Let's delve into these lesser-known aspects of his life and understand how they shaped his legacy. Gideon was an ordinary man, without great achievements or titles. He was the youngest in his family, and his family was the poorest in Manasseh. However, God chose him to deliver Israel from the Midianites. Gideon, however, was full of doubts. He wondered why God allowed Israel to suffer at the hands of the Midianites and whether he had really been chosen to lead the people to victory. This doubt is an important aspect of Gideon's story. He did not blindly accept God's call, but questioned and tested it. He asked God for signs to confirm his choice, and God, in his patience, granted him the signs he asked for. This journey of doubt did not weaken Gideon, but it strengthened him. He learned to trust God and depend on his guidance. After the victory over the Midianites, Gideon faced the challenge of leading Israel. He rejected the people's offer to become their king, saying, "The Lord will reign over you." However, Gideon made an ephod, an object of worship, which the people began to idolize. This led Israel to stray from God, a mistake that had lasting consequences. Gideon's leadership after victory shows that victory itself is not the end. True leadership involves guiding people down the right path and making decisions that honor God. Gideon failed in this regard, and it tarnished his legacy. Gideon's legacy teaches us the importance of looking beyond victory. Victory is important, but what we do after it is equally important. Our actions have consequences and can have a lasting impact. Gideon shows us that we should always seek God's guidance in our decisions and actions. Furthermore, Gideon's legacy reminds us that God uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Gideon was an ordinary man, full of doubts and fears. However, God used him to free Israel. This shows us that God can use any of us, regardless of our weaknesses and doubts. In conclusion, Gideon's life is a story of faith, doubt, victory, and failure. He was an ordinary man whom God used to accomplish an extraordinary feat. However, his life after victory was marked by mistakes that had lasting consequences. His legacy teaches us the importance of looking beyond victory and considering the impact of our actions. I hope this look at Gideon's life has given you a new perspective on his story and legacy. If you like this video, subscribe to the channel, like it, and leave your comments. We would love to hear your thoughts and reflections on Gideon's legacy. Thanks for watching, and until next time.